Behind the thick stone walls of Notre-Dame, artisans and monks diligently crafted sacred objects. This hidden world pulsed with creativity and devotion, shaping the spiritual life of medieval Paris. It would be darker, more crowded, a maze of timber houses leaning over filthy streets, church bells echoing above the rooftops, merchants shouting from crowded bridges, students arguing in Latin, beggars sleeping beside cathedral walls, smoke rising from thousands of hearths, and above it all, the unfinished towers of Notre-Dame watching over a city that was becoming one of the most powerful places in Europe. This is medieval Paris, not the polished city of postcards, but the living, breathing, dangerous heart of the Middle Ages. Intro before Paris became wide boulevards, cafés, museums, and glowing riverfronts, it was a packed medieval city built around faith, trade, learning, and survival. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Paris was one of the largest cities in Europe. Tens of thousands of people crowded inside and around its walls. Kings ruled from here. Scholars came from across the continent. Merchants filled its markets. Pilgrims arrived to pray before sacred relics. And ordinary families lived their lives in narrow rooms above workshops, bakeries, stables, and taverns. But to walk through medieval Paris was to enter a world of sharp contrasts. Gold and mud, prayer and violence, luxury and hunger, the sacred and the filthy pressed together in the same streets. To understand what medieval Paris really looked like, we have to forget the elegant city we know today. We have to step back into a city of smoke, stone, timber, bells, animals, markets, disease, and faith. A city where every street had a sound, every smell told you where you were, and every building revealed who held power. Section 1. The first thing you would notice is the river. The Seine was not just a beautiful feature of the city, it was Paris's lifeline. Boats moved slowly along the water, carrying firewood, wine, grain, stone, fish, and cloth. Barges bumped against the muddy banks. Ferrymen shouted over the noise of the current. Workers unloaded barrels and sacks near the quays, their boots sinking into wet earth. The river divided the city into three worlds. At the center was the Île de la Cité, the island where Paris had begun. This was the spiritual and political heart of the city. Here stood Notre-Dame, royal buildings, courts, prisons, and the homes of powerful church officials. To the north was the right bank, the world of commerce. This was where merchants, craftsmen, butchers, money changers, and market sellers filled the streets. It was noisy, crowded, and constantly moving. To the south was the left bank, the world of students, scholars, monasteries, and schools. Here, young men from across Europe came to study theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. They crowded into lecture halls, rented rooms, taverns, and churches, turning this part of Paris into one of the great intellectual centers of medieval Europe. The bridges connected everything. But medieval bridges were not open, graceful crossings like many bridges today. They were crowded streets in themselves. Houses and shops stood directly on them. Merchants sold goods above the river. People crossed between homes, stalls, animals, carts, and beggars. Looking down through gaps, you could see the Seine rushing beneath your feet. The Grand Pont and Petit Pont were not just bridges. They were marketplaces suspended over water, and as you entered the city across them, Paris would rise around you like a living fortress. Section 2. Medieval Paris was a city of walls. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, King Philip Augustus ordered massive stone walls to be built around Paris. These defenses marked the city's growing importance and the fears of the age. The walls had towers, gates, and guarded entrances. At night, the gates could be closed. Inside, the city became a dense, enclosed world. Unlike modern Paris, medieval Paris did not spread out with broad avenues and open squares. Space was precious. The city grew upward and inward. Houses leaned over the streets, their upper floors jutting out beyond the lower ones. Some buildings were made with timber frames, filled with plaster or wattle and daub. Others were stone, especially where the wealthy or the church had influence. From above, the city would look like a jagged sea of steep roofs, smoking chimneys, church spires, towers, courtyards, and cramped lanes twisting in every direction. The streets were narrow, irregular, and often unpaved. In dry weather, they filled with dust. In rain, they turned to mud. Open drains ran through the middle of some streets. Waste from homes and workshops could be thrown outside. Animals moved among people. Pigs, chickens, dogs, horses, and donkeys were part of the urban scene. The smell would be unforgettable. Wood smoke from hearths, bread baking in ovens, rotting vegetables, tanned hides, fish, manure, sweat, candle wax, wet wool, human waste, incense drifting from churches. Medieval Paris was not silent or clean. It was alive in every direction. Cartwheels rattled over stones. Blacksmiths hammered metal. Bakers called out fresh bread. Church bells marked the hours. Priests chanted. Students debated. Children cried. Dogs barked. Vendors shouted their prices. Somewhere nearby, a fight might break out in an alley. The city was crowded, intimate, and overwhelming. You could not pass through medieval Paris as a distant observer. The city pressed itself against you. Section 3. At the heart of this world rose Notre-Dame. In medieval Paris, Notre-Dame was not simply a monument, it was a vision of heaven built in stone. Construction began in the 12th century, and for generations, the cathedral dominated the skyline of the Ile de la Cité. Its towers, flying buttresses, pointed arches, and enormous rose windows made it one of the greatest achievements of Gothic architecture. To a medieval person, Notre-Dame was almost unimaginable in scale. Most people lived in small, dark rooms. Their streets were narrow, their homes were low, smoky, and crowded. Then they entered the cathedral. Suddenly, the ceiling soared above them like the sky. Colored light poured through stained glass. Candles flickered in the shadows. Incense filled the air. Voices echoed through the nave. Stone saints looked down from the walls. Biblical stories appeared in glass and sculpture for those who could not read. This was architecture designed to move the soul. The cathedral reminded everyone who held spiritual authority. The church shaped life from birth to death. Baptism, marriage, confession, festivals, funerals, saints' days, and weekly mass all gave rhythm to the year. Around Notre-Dame, the island was crowded with clerics, scribes, judges, guards, servants, pilgrims, and merchants, selling food, candles, charms, and religious items. The sacred and the ordinary existed side by side. A man might pray for salvation inside the cathedral, then step outside and bargain over fish, hear a thief being dragged away, or smell waste running through a nearby lane. This was medieval Paris at its most revealing. A city reaching toward heaven while standing ankle-deep in mud. Section 4. If Notre-Dame was the soul of Paris, the markets were its beating heart. On the right bank, Les Halles became one of the great commercial centers of the city. Long before modern iron and glass market halls, this was a dense, chaotic district of stalls, sheds, carts, animals, food, and noise. Before dawn, sellers arrived with produce from the countryside. Farmers brought vegetables, eggs, cheese, and fruit. Fishermen carried baskets from the river and nearby waterways. Butchers prepared meat. Bakers stacked loaves. Wine merchants rolled barrels through the streets. By morning, the market was alive. Women inspected cloth, herbs, onions, and poultry. Servants shopped for wealthy households. Apprentices ran errands. Buyers argued over weight and price. Street vendors sold hot food to workers. Beggars watched the crowds carefully. Pickpockets moved where the press of bodies was thickest. Medieval Paris was organized by trades. Certain streets became known for specific crafts. Shoemakers, metalworkers, cloth merchants, parchment makers, butchers, candle makers, and booksellers clustered together. Many people lived above their workshops, so the boundary between home and labor barely existed. A shop was not just a place of business. It was where children grew up, apprentices slept, meals were cooked, deals were made, and reputations were built. The streets were also theaters of social rank. A wealthy merchant might pass in fine dyed cloth lined with fur, while nearby a laborer carried sacks until his back bent under the weight. A nobleman's servant might push through a crowd. A monk might move silently past a drunken student. A widow might sell bread to survive another week. The city offered opportunity, but it also exposed inequality at every corner. Paris was rich, and Paris was hungry. Section 5. On the left bank, another Paris was taking shape. This was the Paris of books, arguments, lectures, and restless young men. The University of Paris became one of the most important centers of learning in medieval Europe. Students came from France, England, Italy, Germany, and beyond. Many were teenagers or young adults, far from home, living in crowded rented rooms or religious colleges. The streets near the schools were filled with Latin conversation. Lectures were delivered aloud, often in cold halls or church spaces. Books were rare and expensive, copied by hand on parchment. A single volume could represent months of work. Students studied Aristotle, logic, theology, grammar, law, and medicine. They argued about the nature of God, the order of the universe, the meaning of truth, and the structure of society. But student life was not always noble or peaceful. Medieval students had a reputation for drinking, fighting, and causing trouble. Tavern disputes could turn violent. Conflicts between students, townspeople, and authorities were common. The Latin Quarter earned its name from the language of learning, but it was also a place of noise, debt, ambition, and danger. Imagine walking there at dusk. A cold mist hangs over the streets. Candlelight glows from upper windows. A group of students spills out of a tavern laughing too loudly. Somewhere inside a schoolroom, a master lectures by dim light. A scribe bends over parchment, copying words that may shape European thought for centuries. This was one of medieval Paris's greatest contradictions. A city filled with mud and disease was also producing ideas that would echo across civilization. Sections, but medieval Paris was not only a city of cathedrals, scholars, and markets. It was also a place of fear. Disease was a constant presence. Crowding, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and malnutrition made life fragile. Illness could sweep through a neighborhood with terrifying speed. The greatest horror came in the 14th century when the Black Death reached Paris. The plague changed the atmosphere of the city. Streets that once roared with trade could fall strangely quiet. Bells rang for the dead so often that their sound became part of daily terror. Bodies had to be carried away. Families vanished from houses. Clergy risked their lives giving last rites. Some people prayed, others fled. Some blamed outsiders, others saw the catastrophe as divine punishment. No one fully understood what was happening. To live through it was to watch the world become unstable. The city's familiar sounds changed. Fewer market cries, more funeral bells, fewer celebrations, more whispered rumors. Yet even after catastrophe, Paris endured. The markets reopened. The university continued. Churches filled again. Children were born into houses where others had died. Builders returned to stone and timber. Merchants counted coins. Students argued. Bakers lit ovens. Medieval cities survived because they had to. Paris was wounded many times, but it kept breathing. Was Section 7 power was everywhere in medieval Paris, even when it was invisible. The king, the church, noble families, guilds, scholars, and city officials all competed to shape urban life. Royal authority grew stronger over time. The city was not only a religious and commercial center, but a political stage. Royal ceremonies, processions, punishments, and public announcements reminded people that power had a body, a voice, and a route through the streets. Justice could be public and brutal. Punishments were meant to be seen. Crowds gathered for executions, humiliations, and displays of authority. In a world where few people read official documents, spectacle communicated power. But Paris also had moments of beauty and celebration. Religious festivals transformed the streets. Processions carried relics through the city. Bells rang. Banners moved in the wind. Guilds displayed their pride. Candles glowed at night, music echoed through squares and churches. For a brief moment, the same streets that smelled of waste and smoke could become sacred pathways of color, song, and devotion. Medieval life was harsh, but it was not empty of joy. People married, children played, bakers joked with customers, lovers met in shadows, families gathered around fires, workers rested after long days, pilgrims cried before holy relics, craftsmen took pride in what their hands created. History often remembers kings, battles, and cathedrals, but medieval Paris was also made by anonymous lives. A woman kneading dough before sunrise, a mason carving stone high above the ground, a child watching boats on the Seine, a student hearing an idea that changes his life. These small human moments are what made the city real. Section 8. So what did medieval Paris really look like? It looked like a forest of rooftops packed behind walls. It looked like bridges covered with houses. It looked like cathedral towers rising above smoke. It looked like muddy streets where nobles, beggars, monks, merchants, animals, and students passed within inches of each other. It looked like markets bursting with food and fear of hunger. It looked like candlelit interiors, timber beams, stone courtyards, narrow staircases, crowded rooms, and streets so tight that neighbors could speak from opposite windows. It was not romantic in the modern sense. It was intense, physical, spiritual, dangerous, and alive. And yet beneath the filth and hardship, something extraordinary was happening. Paris was becoming a capital of power, thought, worship, and culture. The medieval city laid the foundations for the Paris that would later become a center of art, revolution, fashion, philosophy, and memory. The modern city did not replace medieval Paris completely. It grew from it. Under today's streets are traces of older streets. Beneath elegant facades are deeper histories. Behind the beauty of Paris lies a city that survived fire, plague, war, poverty, and time. The medieval city is still there, if you know where to look, in the stones of Notre-Dame, in the curve of the Seine, in the old street names, in the shadowed corners of the Latin Quarter, in the memory of a city that once smelled of smoke and bread, echoed with bells, and rose from the mud toward heaven. Ending medieval Paris was not the polished dream we often imagine. It was a city of struggle and splendor, where faith shaped the skyline, trade filled the streets, disease haunted every household, and ambition pulled people from across Europe into its crowded lanes. It was beautiful, it was brutal, it was human, and despite plague, fire, violence, and centuries of transformation, Paris endured. The city changed its face many times, but it never lost the power to fascinate the world. Because history never truly disappears, it waits beneath our feet, behind old walls, in the names of streets, and in the stories cities still carry. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval Paris, subscribe for more cinematic history documentaries. And tell us in the comments, which lost city, ancient empire, or forgotten world should we reconstruct next?